In this video, we're going to look at how to find unit rate from a graph. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take some notes on unit rate before we look at one of the graphs. There are a couple different names for unit rate. You can call it unit rate. You can also call it the constant of proportionality. So again, that's constant of proportionality. And that's because when we look at a graph, you're going to see that it's a proportional relationship. We'll talk about that more in another video. In addition, we'll use the letter K to represent unit rate. And some people say that we use the letter K because K is the first letter of the word constant in the German language. So in German, they would spell it constant like that. In the US, we spell constant with a C. But this is supposed to be the reasoning for why we use the letter K to represent unit rate. The other thing you need to know is just that when we're talking about rate, you want to think about the frequency of something occurring. Or you could think of it as how often or how fast. For example, we're going to talk about miles per hour. We'll talk about points per game, so how many points per game. We'll talk about things like words per minute, maybe how fast you can type words per minute, or maybe how fast you can speak words per minute. So that's what I want you to think about when we're going to be talking about rate and unit rate. So now that we've taken some notes, I think that we're ready to look at the graph. We need to recall that the y-axis is the vertical line in a coordinate grid, and the x-axis is the horizontal line. Hopefully you noticed that when I drew the y-axis, I just continued the y. So the tail of the y, I just continue to form the y-axis. That's the way that I remember which is the x-axis and which is the y-axis. When you try to graph a point or name a point, or you could say coordinate on the graph, you have to always put x first and then y second. If you look at the x-axis, you'll notice that there are arrows on the x-axis. There's a left arrow, and then there's also an arrow that goes to the right. To the right, the values are positive. To the left, the values are negative. So you need to keep in your mind that the x value tells you how far you went to the left or to the right on the coordinate grid. When you look at the y-axis, I want you to notice that there's an arrow pointing up. There's also an arrow that is pointing down. So the y controls the upward movement and the downward movement. When you go upwards, these are positive values. When you go downwards, the values become negative. So you're decreasing when you move downwards, you're increasing as you move upwards. I think we're ready to look at a graph. I'm going to scroll up to the title. If you have this printed out in front of you, just make sure the title's the same. So this is Unit Rates and Graphs 1, Integers. So that's the page that we're looking at. And we're going to look at the first graph and examine it before we move on to the other graphs. So I want you to label the x-axis. So that's the x-axis. And then over here, remember this is the y-axis. And we're only showing here the first quadrant. That's the only part of the graph that we're going to look at. We're not going to look at all of the quadrants, just quadrant 1. And that's how it's usually going to be on the EOG. On the x-axis, you'll notice that there's a word that goes there. It says games. That's what x represents. And on the y-axis, you see the word points. So points represents y, or y represents points. The first step we're going to take to figure out what the unit rate is in this graph is we're going to choose a coordinate. And it needs to be a coordinate that falls along this line. I don't know why that came out jagged, but hopefully, let me try to fix that. Hopefully you saw what I was trying to highlight this. It looks like a navy line, maybe black line, I'm not sure. And we're going to choose a coordinate along that line. Now you want to pick a point where the grid lines cross. For example, this would not be a good point to choose. Sorry about that. I was having trouble with my pen, so I erased it, fixed my orientation on my board, and hopefully you can see that point that I chose a little bit better. That's not a good point to choose because when you look at the x-axis and you try to figure out exactly what x value matches with that point, it looks like it might be 3 point, I don't know, 6, maybe 3.7. This marking would represent 3.5 because it's between 3 and it's between 4, but I don't know exactly what this marking is. And then over here, when I try to match it up with the y-axis, again, I'm confused. I know that this is 70, and I know that this is 80, but in between, you know, what is that? 75, 74, 73, 73.5? I'm not really sure. So you don't want to choose a point like that. Instead, you want to choose a point where the grid lines cross. And when I say grid lines, I'm referring to these lines right here. So these are the vertical grid lines. And then let me also show you the horizontal grid lines. So here's the horizontal grid lines. So that's what I'm talking about when I say grid lines. And you want to find where those grid lines perfectly meet. So let me give you an example. I could choose this point right here, and I'll draw in the two grid lines. And in blue, I'll make a little X. There's the point that I've chosen. Now, if you want to record the point that I've chosen, that point is 3. We list 3 first because that's the movement on the y-axis. We went to the right 3. And then second, we're going to list the y value of 60. So 360. And I'm going to choose that point. That's a good point to choose because I know this point is exactly at 3 in terms of the x value and exactly at 60 in terms of the y value. Now that we've chosen our point, we need to find the unit rate. So to find unit rate, we're going to use our unit rate formula. Let me see if I gave that to you in your notes. All right, so I haven't given you that in your notes, so why don't we record that now? So the unit rate formula is k equals y divided by x. Some kids get confused because a coordinate has an x first and then it has the y after that, but in the equation, the y is first and then the x is second. Sometimes in class, I'll just say the word that I made up, yaks, 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 to try to remember it. It's y over x. So yaks, so y and x. You need y and then x, yaks, yaks, yaks. So that's the formula for unit rate. Let's go back to our grid. So we'll record the unit rate formula as k equals y divided by x. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the y value was in our chosen coordinate. So we chose 360 and the y value is 60. So I'm going to plug in 60 for the numerator. In the denominator, I'm going to plug in 3 because the x value is 3. From here, I also need to fill in my units. So my units on the y-axis, we talked about this earlier, y represents points. And then over here, I'm going to record points. On the x-axis, take a look. The word is games. We're going to write games. So 60 goes with points, so 60 points, and the 3 went with games, so 3 games. And I always also have students in between, kind of in the place of the fraction bar, I have students write the word per. So when you're thinking about the units or the rate that we're referring to, we're thinking about the number of points per game. To solve for the unit rate, all you're going to do is you're going to divide. So you're going to take 60 and you're going to divide it by 3. Some people can do this in their head, but if you can't, just think about it how you would, in previous years. How many times does 3 go into 6? It goes in twice. 3 times 2 is 6. You put a 6 there. You subtract, and you get a remainder of 0. I bring the other 0 down. How many times does 3 go into 0? It goes in 0 times. And there's nothing else here to bring down, so we know that we're finished. So 60 divided by 3, you get a unit rate of 20. So up here, I'm going to fill in 20. But I want to remember to not just fill in the number, I want to also fill in the units. So I'm going to write 20 points per game. So the answer is 20 points per game. That's the unit rate. This would have worked with any point that I choose on the graph except for 0, 0. Let me choose another point and really quickly just fill in the formula so you can see that you'll get the same answer. Let's say instead that I would have chosen the point 480. So the point is 480. I'll label X and I'll label Y. And then I'll record the formula down here. Actually, I've already filled it out. So I'll just leave what I have, but I'll replace the Y with, this time Y is 80. And this time X is 4. And I can write back in if I want to, points goes with Y. I put the word per in between. And if you'll recall X, the X-axis went with games. And if you take 80 and divide it by 4, you're also going to get 20. So 20 points per game. Remember when I told you that K represented the word constant? It's another word for unit rate. Well, that's because the unit rate is constant throughout when you have a proportional relationship. So any point you choose along this grid, except for 0, 0, is going to give you the answer of 20. So I could have chosen any coordinate to find my answer. And we'll do more of this in another video. I think that's enough for this video.